It was just another live debate until Jasmine Crockett's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, saw the name Ibrahim Traoré, and everything stopped. Moments later, she broke down in tears on live TV. What did the president of Burkina Faso say that shook her so deeply? Stick around. The truth behind that call will shock you. It was a typical Friday morning on Daylight Politics. The studio was alive with sharp suits, brighter lights, and the usual quiet tension that buzzes just before the red light blinks live. Jasmine Crockett sat at the center of the panel, poised, intelligent, and commanding respect without ever raising her voice. Her name carried weight in political circles, and her reputation for holding guests accountable was legendary. She adjusted the earpiece in her left ear while glancing down at the day's run sheet, a segment on U.S.-Africa trade negotiations. She had done this dance 100 times. The panelists for the day included a conservative economist, a liberal policy advisor, and a former diplomat, tame compared to the usual lineup. She was prepared to moderate, fact-check, and move the conversation forward, like she always did. As the show opened, Jasmine smiled effortlessly into the camera. Good morning, America. Today we're talking global trade, who's winning, who's losing, and what the United States needs to get right before it's too late. She looked to her left, inviting the economist to make his first point. Let's be honest here, he said, adjusting his tie. The U.S. has been far too lenient in these bilateral agreements, especially with countries in West Africa, Burkina Faso, for instance, where corruption and instability make any trade benefits a one-way street. Jasmine kept a polite smile but raised a brow. Careful, she said with a hint of steel in her tone. That sounds like a sweeping generalization. Would you say the same about countries in Eastern Europe or South America, where corruption also exists, but where we continue to trade? He chuckled nervously. Well, it's a different context. Or a different skin color, she replied, unblinking. The studio went silent for half a beat, Jasmine's kind of silence, the kind that demanded truth. The other panelists leaned forward, sensing the shift. The policy advisor jumped in to add nuance, explaining that trade structures often ignored the history of exploitation in many African regions. Jasmine nodded, always listening. She wasn't just a host, she was a channel between the facts and the public. But the tension that morning wasn't just political, it was something else, something unspoken, invisible, the kind of stillness before a thunderclap. As they shifted to a segment on rare earth minerals and the ethics of sourcing materials from African mines, Jasmine glanced down at her desk for a split second. She noticed her phone vibrate once, then go silent. Odd. Everyone on her team knew she was live. She tilted the phone slightly to see the screen. The name lit up in bold letters, President Ibrahim Traoré. Her heart skipped. The president of Burkina Faso? Calling her directly now? She swallowed hard. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't miss a beat. She continued moderating, her mind racing. It could be a mistake, a prank, a spoofed number, or it could be real. The diplomat on the panel was midway through explaining how mineral wealth was both a blessing and a curse when the phone buzzed again. Same name, same number. Jasmine's calm exterior cracked ever so slightly. Her fingers hovered above the phone. This wasn't normal. World leaders didn't call live TV hosts in the middle of tapings, unless something was wrong. Jasmine subtly gestured to the producers off camera while keeping her voice steady. Let's take a deeper look at the numbers, she said, cueing the graphics team to fill the screen so she could check the call more discreetly. But there it was again. The name, the urgency. Ibrahim Traoré. Her instinct screamed at her. She knew it wasn't about politics, not the usual kind at least. She excused herself from the table, standing up mid-show, unprecedented. I'm sorry, she said, her voice lower now. I have to take this call. Her panelists stared, surprised. The cameras kept rolling. America watched, puzzled, unaware that something historic was about to unfold. Jasmine stepped away from the panel table, clutching her phone like it was something fragile and burning at the same time. The studio's noise dulled behind her as she moved toward the hallway just off the set, the buzzing still echoing faintly in her hand. She answered with a hesitant swipe, raising the phone to her ear. This is Jasmine Crockett, she said, breath caught somewhere between professionalism and alarm. The voice on the other end was deep, accented, calm, but heavy with urgency. Ms. Crockett, this is President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. I apologize for reaching you directly. I did not know how else to get through. She blinked. It was him. Yes, I recognize your voice. How can I help you, Mr. President? Her tone shifted instinctively to that of a journalist, but her nerves betrayed her composure. Traoré didn't waste time. We've discovered something terrible this morning in the Cascades region. I was briefed just an hour ago. Our military and rescue teams raided a mine. We believed it to be abandoned, illegal, run through a shell corporation, likely foreign-backed. Jasmine's hand pressed against her chest. There were children, he said flatly. Dozens, kept underground, working. Silence. What? Do you mean working? They were trafficked, we think. Forced labor. Some are no older than 6. Most of them are malnourished. Many have respiratory infections. A few are dead. The mine was over 700 meters deep. No sunlight, no oxygen systems. They lived in that tunnel, slept in it, ate in it, if they ate at all. Jasmine felt her knees buckle slightly. She steadied herself against the wall. Oh my God! He paused, then continued, his voice sharp with moral fury. And the worst part, the mine's paperwork leads back to a company registered in Delaware. The operations were funneled through a subsidiary with an American name. Your country is involved. Knowingly or not, I do not know. But I have tried every official channel. No one is responding to me. No one picks up. Jasmine inhaled sharply, her brain struggling to process what she was hearing. I'm on live television right now, she murmured. We're discussing African trade policy. Your country came up 5 minutes ago. I know, he said. That's why I called. That's why I chose you. I watched what you said about fairness, about race, about history. I believed you. So now I ask you, please talk about this. Talk about what they did to our children. She was silent for a moment, mouth slightly open, unable to form words. Her fingers tightened around the phone until they turned white. Traoré continued, his voice softer now. We found one girl, barely alive, hiding behind a slab of broken rock. She whispered, please don't send me back. That's what she said, as if the mine was her home and we were her enemy. What does that tell you, Miss Crockett? Jasmine felt tears rise behind her eyes. I don't know what's happening to this world, she whispered. You don't have to know, he said. Just don't let them ignore it. Her voice cracked. How many children? He hesitated. We've counted 37 so far, maybe more if the others are still alive, or if we find the missing. The mine runs deep, and parts of it collapsed. Jasmine closed her eyes, pressing the back of her head against the cold wall. The image of small hands scraping at rock, of lungs coughing in the darkness, of American investors sipping wine while children suffocated in tunnels. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I'm not calling for your apology, he interrupted gently. I'm calling for your voice. She nodded, though he couldn't see her. You'll have it. A producer peeked around the corner, eyes wide. Jasmine, you okay? We're still rolling. She turned toward him slowly, her eyes glassy and red. I need to go back in, she said. Are you sure? You look... I have to say something, right now. She brought the phone back to her ear. Mr. President, thank you. I promise you, everyone will hear this. I hope so, he said quietly, because if they don't, more children will die. She ended the call with trembling fingers and took a long, uneven breath. Then she walked back into the studio, not as a polished anchor, but as a woman carrying the weight of a truth so devastating it would shake the country by the end of the day. Jasmine walked back onto the set like someone moving through water, slow, deliberate, visibly changed. Her stride no longer carried the sharp confidence viewers were used to. It was steadied only by the urgency of what she now knew. The studio lights hit her face, revealing the flush in her cheeks, the sheen of tears just beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. The panelists were still seated, murmuring among themselves, unsure of whether to continue or wait. The show was still live, But the producers had temporarily cut to B-roll of African mining footage, buying her a moment. She didn't wait for a cue. She returned to her seat, sat down, and stared into the camera. Her fingers were shaking, and she didn't even bother to hide it. Her voice when it came was quieter than usual, but it stopped everyone cold. "I need to speak directly to our viewers," she said. "I've just taken a phone call that I never expected, and I can't pretend it didn't happen." The studio fell completely silent. The panelists leaned in, confused but alert. "That call was from President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso," she said, pausing to swallow. "And what he just told me, I don't have words for it yet, but I'll try." She looked down, took a slow breath, then met the camera again. "Just this morning, in the early hours of their day, Burkina Faso forces raided an illegal mining operation in the Cascades region. They believed it to be abandoned. Instead, they found something else, something horrifying. A long beat. They found children." The panelists straightened. One of them mouthed, "What?" "Not a few," Jasmine said, voice trembling. "Dozens. More than 30 children, trafficked, some as young as 6 years old, were forced to work underground in a mine that reached over 700 meters deep. 700. These kids were living there, sleeping in tunnels, working in shifts, breathing in dust with no ventilation. Many are malnourished. A few are dead." Gasps spread across the panel. The studio staff, the camera crew, even the makeup assistant at the far wall, all froze. "And that mine," Jasmine continued, her voice now tightening with controlled fury, "is linked directly to a corporation registered here, in the United States, a shell company, paper trails through Delaware, and shell subsidiaries abroad. This wasn't some rogue gang in the forest. This was financed, structured, protected." The economist on the panel started to say something, but Jasmine held up a hand, not aggressively, but firmly. "Please, let me finish." Her voice cracked now, emotion spilling out. "President Traoré told me that when they found one little girl, barely alive, she begged not to be taken back. Because in her mind, mine was her home. She had never seen daylight, not for weeks, maybe months." Tears streamed down Jasmine's face. She didn't wipe them. "He said the children were coughing up blood, that some were so traumatized they didn't speak. Others were found curled in corners, hiding behind slabs of rock, thinking the rescue team had come to hurt them." The panelists were silent. One had tears in her eyes. The crew didn't dare move. The feed was still live. And the world, millions watching, was suddenly no longer just watching a morning political show. They were witnessing something real, unfiltered, raw. Jasmine looked directly into the lens. "This morning we were sitting here, discussing African trade policy like it was just theory, like it was numbers on paper. But this is what's behind some of those numbers. This is the cost that never makes it into our charts. This is the cost we export and hide." Her voice faltered again, and she gritted her teeth. "I know we're not supposed to go off script. I know we're supposed to keep things neutral, balanced. But how do you stay balanced when a head of state calls you crying for help? When children are dying underground for minerals that end up in our phones, our jewelry, our tech? How do you sit here and talk about tariffs when we won't even face the truth?" She paused, visibly shaking. "I am not okay right now. I don't want to pretend I am. Because if I act like this is just another story, then I'm part of the lie too." Silence. Then a whisper from the co-host seated beside her. "Do we have any confirmation on this?" Jasmine turned to him slowly. "He knew I'd ask that. He's already sent me documentation, audio recordings, pictures, video footage, and I'm going to show some of it right now." She gestured off camera, and the producers, scrambling but respectful, switched to the first photo that Traoré had forwarded. It was grainy but unmistakable. A child, no older than 9, caked in dirt, his eyes red and swollen, a makeshift bandage around his hand, sitting on the ground next to a steel drill twice his size. The image stayed on screen for 5 long seconds. Jasmine, unable to continue for the moment, covered her mouth with her hand. Her shoulders shook. She wasn't performing. She was breaking. And America saw it. All of it. For nearly a full minute, Jasmine couldn't speak. Her hand trembled visibly as it hovered near her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. The picture still lingered on screen, just one boy in a collapsing mine, but it said more than 1,000 words could. The pain in his face, the grime in every wrinkle of his skin, the numbness in his eyes. It was unbearable, not just to look at, but to realize. Millions of people watching at home sat frozen. No one reached for their remote. No one looked away. And then Jasmine finally lowered her hand. She took a breath, wounded, jagged, and sat up straighter, blinking back tears that kept coming, unchecked. "Look," she said, voice hushed. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, and I don't know how much more of this we can ignore. But I promised President Traoré I would not let this story disappear, and I won't." She reached down and picked up her phone, holding it carefully like it was a sacred object. "I have documents right here, company names, transaction records, wire transfers, shell accounts, everything pointing to a mining operation backed by a US-based investment firm." She tapped the screen, scrolled, and continued reading. This company set up an operation through 2 layers of subsidiaries, one in Dubai, one in Côte d'Ivoire. Their official filings declare agricultural services, but the address listed is a known industrial site in the Cascades region. That's the same place where those kids were found, the same tunnels. And the parent company? Their office is in Wilmington, Delaware. One panelist finally broke their stunned silence. "Do we know who owns the firm?" Jasmine nodded slowly. "Yes, a hedge fund, medium-sized, quiet, connected to several defense contractors and a couple of familiar political donors. I'm not naming names yet, not until we verify every piece. But this isn't just some rogue outfit. These people have lobbyists." The panelist leaned back, speechless. Jasmine turned her gaze back to the camera. "So here's what I want every viewer to understand. This isn't about Burkina Faso. This isn't about a distant country or a faraway crime. This is about us, our phones, our batteries, our comfort. The price is being paid by children in the dark, by hands so small they can barely grip the tools they're forced to use." She gestured back toward the photo now gone from the screen. "That little boy? He didn't ask to mine cobalt. He didn't ask to be trafficked. He didn't ask to be buried alive so that we can drive electric cars or make faster phones." Her voice was tight now, almost angry. "And yet our economy is tied to it. Our silence funds it. Our indifference buries them." Another image came on screen. This time a girl no older than 7, her back turned to the camera, standing in front of a jagged rock wall with blood running down her legs. No shoes, no light. The panelist to Jasmine's left covered her mouth. One of the producers swore softly behind the scenes. Jasmine's voice cracked again. "That girl, she survived, but barely. She's in a hospital right now in Bobo Dioulasso, recovering from malnutrition and blunt force trauma. She doesn't remember how long she was down there. When they rescued her, she was afraid to speak. And when she finally did, all she said was, 'Is my sister still in the hole?'" Jasmine couldn't hold it back anymore. She broke, fully. Tears poured down her face. Her hands covered her eyes. Her shoulders heaved. And for the first time in the show's history, the camera didn't cut away. She cried, not silently, not subtly, but the way someone cries when they are shattered by the truth. It wasn't a performance. It was grief. Raw, violent grief. For children she'd never met. For a system she couldn't unsee anymore. And for a country she suddenly realized was far more complicit than she'd ever understood. The panel sat frozen. No one filled the silence. No one dared. Finally, after long moments, Jasmine wiped her face and exhaled shakily. Her voice was hoarse, her mascara streaked. "I don't know what happens next," she said, "but I know what can't happen." She stared into the lens, into the homes of millions. "We can't pretend this didn't happen. We can't go back to arguing over political slogans while children are trapped in corporate graves. We can't go on talking about trade like it's just numbers on a page when those numbers are soaked in blood." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This is the list of American companies tied to illegal mining operations in West Africa. I will spend the rest of this week naming every single one of them. On this show, in print, On every platform I have. The panelists looked stunned. Jasmine turned to them finally. You still want to talk trade policy? She asked quietly. Because I do. But this time, let's talk about the kind of trade that turns children into commodities. No one said a word. No one could. Jasmine leaned forward, looked back into the camera one last time. If you're watching this right now, and you're as angry or heartbroken or helpless as I am, don't just sit there. Don't turn the channel. Don't scroll past. Ask your companies where their minerals come from. Ask your politicians what they're doing to stop this. Ask why a mother in Texas gets to hold her child while a mother in Burkina Faso has to bury hers for your smartphone. She exhaled again, this time with resolve. Ibrahim Traoré didn't call the State Department. He called a journalist, because we've made a world where power doesn't listen, but truth still has a voice. And right now, this is mine. The screen faded to black, and for the first time in a long time, the truth didn't just trend. It broke America wide open. The morning after Jasmine Crockett's emotional breakdown aired, the world wasn't the same. The clip of her crying, real, raw, trembling as she named the horrors buried 700 meters beneath West African soil, had exploded across every corner of the internet. It wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. On news sites, on social media, on conservative pages, liberal pages, and international outlets. People who had never watched daylight politics were sharing it with captions like, "Watch this until the end. This broke me. No more silence." The video hit 5 million views in 12 hours. By the end of the day, it had crossed 20 million. But this wasn't just a viral moment. It was an eruption. Jasmine hadn't just cried. She had exposed a fault line in the global system. And what lay beneath was darker than anyone wanted to admit. By noon, President Traoré's team released a formal statement. It included footage from the mine, some of it too disturbing for television. In one clip, a rescue worker carries a limp, dust-covered child out of the shaft. The child's fingers are still wrapped around a broken mining chisel. Another clip shows a teenager, barely alive, muttering numbers under his breath. A rescuer translates, "He's counting how many days he thinks he's been underground. He stopped at 73. Jasmine had promised she would name names, and she did. The next day's episode of Daylight Politics opened not with headlines, but with a list. She read out the names of 5 U.S. companies whose financial trails led to the mine. She backed it up with documents on the screen, ownership filings, emails, wire transfer dates, and then she read the name of a lobbyist, a former senator, whose firm represented one of those companies in Washington just 3 months ago. The response was electric. Senators were suddenly being hounded by reporters in the Capitol hallways. Tech CEOs posted carefully worded statements of concern. NGOs working on supply chain transparency were flooded with interview requests. But the most visceral reactions came from ordinary people. Outside the headquarters of one of the exposed investment firms in Manhattan, a crowd gathered with signs that read, "Who dies for your profit? Burkina's children are not your battery. Justice for 700 meters." And in the comments beneath the video, a recurring phrase appeared again and again. "I can't unsee this." Jasmine, too, couldn't unsee it. Off air, she received death threats from shadowy accounts. She was warned, subtly and not so subtly, to stop talking. But she refused. And something shifted in the media because of it. For once, it wasn't about clicks or party lines. It was about what was right. It became harder for networks to ignore what she had exposed. Suddenly, child labor in mining wasn't a niche issue for nonprofits. It was breaking news. International pressure surged. In Europe, the EU Parliament accelerated talks on mandatory supply chain transparency. In Washington, a bipartisan bill, stalled for years, was fast-tracked. The Clean Minerals Act, which would require tech companies to prove ethical sourcing of all cobalt, lithium, and rare earth materials, suddenly had real momentum. But the impact wasn't just political. It was personal. People started asking questions. Parents asked where their children's school tablets came from. Young consumers emailed their favorite brands. Some tech stores reported a surge of people returning devices, not because they were faulty, but because customers wanted to know who made this, who suffered for this. And in Burkina Faso, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, international journalists flooded into the region, not for war stories or famine footage, but to talk to survivors, to amplify voices long buried. Jasmine flew to Burkina Faso 1 week later. She met with President Traoré. She met with the children. She sat on the edge of a hospital bed and held the hand of the girl who had asked for her sister. The girl's name was Amira. She had a soft voice, barely a whisper. When asked what she wanted most, she said, "To learn how to read." That footage aired on a Friday night. America wept again, and something else happened. Quiet, but massive. Donations poured in, not to corporations or politicians, but to the people on the ground. Doctors, rescuers, teachers. A nonprofit started a campaign to build a school near the site of the mine. They called it the 700-meter light. And Jasmine, she never returned to being just a TV personality. That phone call had altered her permanently. She didn't try to go back to normal. She wrote a book, taught a seminar on journalism and moral courage. And every time someone asked her why she cried that day, she answered simply, "Because I finally saw what we were trying not to see." And millions had seen it with her. The world had been cracked open. And even though the system didn't fall that day, it started shaking. 2 months had passed since Jasmine Crockett broke down on live television. What began as a desperate phone call from West Africa had become an unrelenting wave, a truth too big to contain, too human to forget. The viral clip of her crying still made its rounds online, but by now, the story had outgrown the moment. It had rooted itself in people's minds, in institutions, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and in boardrooms. One by one, the companies named by Jasmine came under investigation. 2 were served with subpoenas. Another, under mounting pressure from shareholders, fired its entire board and restructured. The hedge fund behind the Delaware shell company went silent for weeks, then emerged with a carefully worded press release denying any knowledge of child labor and promising a full internal audit. It didn't work. By then the damage was done, not just to their reputation, but to the illusion that this kind of exploitation was distant or disconnected. It wasn't. People had felt it, and no one felt it more deeply than Jasmine. The trip to Burkina Faso had changed her. She didn't come back with sound bites. She came back quieter, more reflective, more committed. In interviews, she stopped using the term story altogether. "This isn't a story," she said. "This is a wound, and wounds don't heal when you look away." She testified before Congress, twice. Her testimony was blunt, specific, and devastating. She brought photos, recordings, a statement from President Traoré. But it was her words, simple, raw, that echoed through the hearing room and made headlines. We are not innocent. We are not uninformed. We are implicated. And if we choose not to act, then we are no longer just bystanders. We are accomplices. The room fell so silent you could hear pens drop. But something else was happening behind the scenes. Something Jasmine didn't even know about yet. A young congressional staffer who'd watched Jasmine's original broadcast had quietly reached out to a group of federal investigators. He handed over a document that hadn't aired, a third-party audit report buried in regulatory filings. That document named another firm, one much larger than the others, a major player in global tech supply chains, a name every household knew. And that firm, it was about to go under the microscope. 2 weeks later, the Justice Department announced the unthinkable, a federal investigation into forced labor and human rights abuses linked to one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world. The company's stock plummeted 19% in a single day. At the same time, across the ocean, President Traoré was doing something few African leaders had ever done. He publicly challenged global companies by name. "You want our minerals," he said at a press conference, "but you don't want our dignity." That ends now. Burkina Faso began imposing new conditions for resource extraction, transparent contracts, worker protection standards, and third-party inspections. Other African nations started to follow: Niger, Mali, Guinea. It was a shift not just in policy, but in posture. Back in the U.S., schools began teaching about modern supply chains. not just from an economic lens, but from a human one. In classrooms, students watched Jasmine's broadcast. Teachers paused the video during her breakdown, not to discuss her tears, but to ask, why did it take someone breaking down for us to start paying attention? Meanwhile, Jasmine kept going. She launched a digital platform, the 700 Report, dedicated to investigating hidden labor practices in global industries. She hired researchers, journalists, and translators, not just to chase headlines, but to give voice to the voiceless, former miners, survivors, whistleblowers, and Amira, the little girl Jasmine had met in the hospital. She was now enrolled in school, not just any school, the 700-meter light, the one built by the global outpouring of donations. A new classroom was built from the ruins of a mine, a space filled with books instead of drills. With light instead of dust, Jasmine kept in touch with her, sent letters, helped fund her education, and one morning Jasmine received a photo. Amira was smiling, holding up a piece of paper. It was the first sentence she had ever written in French. It read, "Je suis libre." I am free. Jasmine stared at the photo for a long time, and she wept, not from sorrow but from something else, something like justice, something like hope. The story didn't end there. It won't ever truly end, because the system that put those children underground still exists, because the hunger for cheap labor, for easy profit, for unaccountable power, it hasn't disappeared. But something else had awakened. A journalist cried on live television, and the world listened. And for once, listening led to action. Jasmine Crockett never set out to be a hero. She didn't plan a revolution, but when the call came, she didn't look away. And that changed everything. 1 year had passed, 12 full months since Jasmine Crockett received that call on live TV. The call that shattered her, that exposed a quiet, corporate cruelty buried under the surface of modern life. But the world had not moved on. It had evolved. In the time since, the ripple she started had grown into a tide, one that was still crashing into boardrooms, legislatures, and living rooms across the globe. People now knew. People had seen. And once you've seen children digging in the dark for the minerals in your pocket, ignorance no longer feels comfortable. It feels complicit. Jasmine had become more than a journalist. She was now a force. Her platform, the 700 Report, had exposed over 24 supply chain abuses around the world, across industries as varied as fashion, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. But it was the cobalt mines in West Africa that remained her heartbeat, her origin, her promise. She returned to Burkina Faso again, this time with a delegation of international human rights observers and independent auditors. But she didn't walk into the mine shafts. She walked into the school. The 700-meter light had grown. It now serves over 200 students, many of whom were rescued from the mines. The youngest was 5, the oldest 14. Their laughter filled the air. The chalkboard was dusty with equations. On the far wall hung a mural painted by the children, sunlight rising out of a dark tunnel, and a small child holding a book. Amira was in the front row. She stood up when Jasmine entered the room, smiling, confident. She wore a clean white uniform and held her reader close to her chest. Her French was fluent now. She even spoke some English. She walked up to Jasmine and said softly, "When you cried on TV, you cried for me." Jasmine bent down, hugged her tight. It was the kind of moment no camera could truly capture. Later that night, Jasmine sat with President Ibrahim Traoré under the stars on the edge of Ouagadougou. The president looked out over the land and said, "A year ago, I made a choice. I could have called an ambassador. I could have called a president. But I called a woman who asked too many questions." Jasmine smiled. "And I answered." "You did more than that," he said. "You turned the world toward us, not with force, not with fear, with truth." That truth had spread. The Clean Minerals Act was passed in the U.S., the strongest supply chain ethics law in modern history. Companies were now required to certify the origins of every critical mineral, down to the gram. Violations were met with multi-million-dollar fines, executive liability, and in some cases, criminal prosecution. Europe followed suit, Canada, even some Asian nations. The new era of ethical accountability had begun. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Tech companies now brag about ethical sourcing, not as marketing spin, but as survival. Brands that had ignored the issue were hemorrhaging customers. The next generation of consumers had spoken with their wallets. We don't want blood in our batteries. Back home, Jasmine had changed too. She no longer hosted daylight politics. She had walked away from the studio, from the panels, from the sterile lights and controlled chaos. Not because she didn't care, but because she now knew that truth couldn't be boxed in with time limits and talking points. She had become a global speaker, a writer, and a mentor to young investigative journalists. Her lectures weren't about journalism alone, they were about conscience. When you see something horrifying and you don't know what to do, start by not looking away. Truth begins with refusal. And there was something else. The girl from Texas who once spoke with practiced poise now spoke with something deeper. A righteous clarity, unshaken by power, unafraid of consequence. When asked on a late-night interview show what drove her, she said, "I saw a child buried alive for my convenience, and I cried because I had to admit that I benefited from that pain. That's where my change began. We cannot be free until our comfort stops costing someone else's childhood." The host, normally witty and aloof, fell silent, and in the audience someone stood up and asked, "Do you think it's enough?" Jasmine paused. "No," she said, "it's not enough. Not yet. Because for every child we've saved, there are more still underground, figuratively and literally. This isn't about feeling better. It's about doing better every single day." She looked out into the crowd, her voice steady. "I don't want your tears. I want your action." And so the movement lived on, not because of one viral moment, but because people chose to stay awake. In a world addicted to distraction, Jasmine Crockett had proven that truth, when told with courage, still has power. That a single voice, cracked and trembling, could shake nations. And far away in a once-forgotten part of Burkina Faso, a girl named Amira now taught her younger sister how to read. The mine where she once worked was sealed shut and the land reclaimed. In its place stood a garden, and in that garden, a plaque. "To those buried in silence, may your stories rise in the light." Jasmine visited often, not as a journalist, but as someone who had learned the most sacred kind of truth, that once you cry for justice, you must never stop working for it. 2 years had passed since Jasmine Crockett's tears first fell on live television. What had started as a moment of pain, a crack in the mask of political composure, had transformed into a global reckoning. But now in year 2, something else was becoming clear. This wasn't just a story of corporate abuse, child labor, or political courage. This was becoming a story about what comes next. Jasmine had come to understand something that haunted her more than anything else. Exposure was not the end. It was only the beginning. Because the system didn't just survive in silence, it adapted to noise. Public relations teams had begun weaving words like ethical, sustainable, and transparent into their campaigns like thread in a well-cut suit. Companies launched splashy initiatives. Websites changed. Logos were redesigned in softer colors. But Jasmine noticed something strange. When her team at the 700 report dug into the numbers behind some of these clean companies, what they found was a game of shell companies, staged audits, and a new form of moral outsourcing. The mines still existed. They were just renamed. The children were still working, but now under subcontractors that didn't officially exist on paper. It was a cruel evolution. The system had learned how to hide better. Jasmine's team leaked documents to the press. They released a 90-minute expose titled "The Second Silence." It showed how some corporations, instead of ending abuse, had simply shifted the suffering deeper into the shadows. New front companies in Congo, new untraceable routes through ports in West Africa, a new kind of invisibility. The response was rage, not just from the public, but from within the system itself. A group of young lawmakers, Republican and Democrat, formed the Supply Chain Integrity Caucus and introduced a new bill that would fund independent, unannounced inspections of foreign mines used by U.S.-based corporations. It passed the House by a narrow margin, but its real power came from the public watching. People didn't just care anymore. They expected answers. Shareholder meetings turned tense. CEOs were interrupted mid-presentation by activists holding up photos of children in tunnels. One major tech firm was forced to halt production after journalists uncovered a hidden mining deal tied to child labor. Suddenly, ethics weren't optional. They were a cost of doing business. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, change had taken root. President Traoré had implemented the toughest child labor protections in West Africa. With international support, he created an independent regulatory body, staffed by locals to oversee mineral extraction and labor standards. Every mine now required a license. Every child found underground triggered an automatic shutdown and investigation. Traoré credited Jasmine publicly, again and again. "She didn't just expose our pain," he said. "She stood with us long enough to help build something better." And Jasmine, she didn't slow down. She traveled across the globe, documenting new forms of hidden labor, fishing boats off Indonesia, sweatshops in Bangladesh, and lithium pits in South America. But it was her speech at the United Nations that marked the turning point. Standing before diplomats and dignitaries from nearly every nation, she spoke without notes. Her voice was calm, but every word struck like a drumbeat. "You speak of development, of progress, of cooperation. But I ask you, what is progress built on the backs of children worth? What is your GDP if it's mined from a grave?" The room was silent. You have the power to write treaties, to sanction, to regulate, but none of it matters unless you believe the people underground matter, not as numbers, as human beings. She ended with a question. How much dignity are you willing to trade for convenience? Her words echoed far beyond the UN chambers. A movement called Dignity First was born, led by students, workers, activists, religious leaders, and even some business executives who had grown tired of the lies. It spread across continents. Marches were held in over 50 countries. Jasmine attended one in Nairobi, walking alongside a line of barefoot children carrying signs that read, "We are not your cost-saving strategy. We are the future you buried." And again she wept. But it wasn't the same kind of crying as before. This time it wasn't from shock or grief. It was something else, a kind of release, a kind of knowing, because now she wasn't crying alone. In Texas, her hometown school had renamed its library after her, the Jasmine Crockett Learning Center. Inside it hung a photo of her, not behind a desk or in front of a camera, but holding hands with a young girl in a dusty classroom in Burkina Faso. The girl was Amira. Now 10, fluent in French and English, she had just been accepted into a regional program for gifted children. She wanted to be a writer. Jasmine still called her once a week. Their last conversation had ended with Amira saying something that Jasmine would never forget. "You didn't just rescue me. You gave me a pen, and now I can tell my own story." It struck Jasmine then. This was always the point, not to be the hero, not to stay in the spotlight, but to hand the light to someone else. That evening, Jasmine returned to her desk. A new report had come in, another story of buried lives, of suffering hidden behind the glow of modern comfort. She picked up her pen and began writing, not for ratings, not for recognition, but because somewhere out there, another child was waiting, and Jasmine Crockett had made a promise the world would never forget. "As long as you are in the dark, I will not stop speaking." 3 years had passed. The headlines had faded, as headlines always do. The trending hashtags were gone, replaced by new ones, fresh scandals, fresh causes. But beneath the noise, something enduring had taken root. Not a moment, a movement. And at its center, still unshaken, was Jasmine Crockett. No longer a TV host, no longer just a reporter. She had become something rare in public life, a truth bearer. Someone who hadn't simply exposed injustice but had stayed with it, stood beside it, fought for it long after the cameras turned away. By the third anniversary of the live broadcast that changed everything, Jasmine had grown quieter in the public eye, but louder where it mattered. She now worked mostly behind the scenes. The 700 report had expanded into a global coalition. Lawyers, economists, child psychologists, labor auditors, tech developers, and former victims of modern slavery. It wasn't just media anymore. It was infrastructure for justice. One of their boldest new projects was a decentralized blockchain system called MinerTrace, which allowed raw materials like cobalt, lithium, and rare earth minerals to be tracked from their source, block by block, to the final product. No more plausible deniability. No more, we didn't know. And for the first time, companies could no longer hide behind third parties, intermediaries, or false paperwork. They were either clean or complicit, and MinerTrace made that data public. Some nations pushed back, calling it Western interference. Some CEOs claimed it was too expensive, too complicated, but consumers didn't listen. They demanded proof. One major tech manufacturer, known globally, was caught falsifying data in the MinerTrace system. The scandal brought down the CEO, sparked a class action lawsuit, and forced the company to shutter 3 overseas factories. And Jasmine? She didn't say, "I told you so." She released a one-line statement: "We build tools so the truth can defend itself." Meanwhile, in West Africa, something extraordinary had happened. Burkina Faso had become a model, not just of resource ethics, but of sovereignty with conscience. With help from independent bodies, they began processing and refining a portion of their minerals in-country, providing thousands of new adult jobs and radically reducing the demand for illicit labor. The president's bold vision, once dismissed as idealistic, was now being studied by economists worldwide. And Amira? She was now 11 in secondary school and had published a short story in a Pan-African children's magazine. It was called The Girl Who Slept in Stone. In it, a young girl trapped inside a mine dreams of sunlight until one day, a voice from the sky speaks her name and pulls her into the light. In the dedication, Amira wrote, "For the woman who cried when I couldn't. Thank you for hearing me." Jasmine had framed the page. She kept it beside her laptop, next to a small stone Amira had once given her from the tunnel. A stone, the girl said she'd clutched every night as a prayer. 3 years ago, Jasmine would have called that naive. Now she understood it was sacred, but with all the progress, new threats emerged. Certain industries began redefining child labor through loopholes, calling it informal work or family participation. In some regions, as enforcement increased, cartels took over the mines. Smuggling operations adapted. They were more secretive, more violent. The war against injustice wasn't linear. It fought back. And there were days Jasmine felt the weight of it all, especially when she saw images of new children in new countries living the same nightmare under a different flag. But she never stopped, because now there was something else keeping her going. Replication. Journalists inspired by her work began forming investigative pods of their own. In Latin America, Southeast Asia, Central Europe, women and men who said, "If she did it, so can I." Some had never held a press badge. They didn't need to. They had the truth in a platform she had helped build. One night during a small gathering in D.C., a young Kenyan activist approached her. He handed her a worn notebook and said, "This movement may have started with your tears, but it continues with our voices." She opened the notebook. Inside were 47 handwritten testimonies from miners, families, whistleblowers, and survivors. The raw voices of the world that Jasmine had helped unearth. She closed the book gently and said, "Then let's make sure the world hears them all." At that moment, she realized what she had truly built. Not a career, not a brand, a channel. A channel for the unheard to speak for themselves. The next morning, Jasmine received a secure message on her encrypted server. It was anonymous, short. It read, "There are children under the river. You don't know their names yet, but they need you." Coordinates were attached. Without hesitation, she began planning the trip. Because it never ends. Because the world keeps hiding its sins in deep, dark places. And Jasmine Crockett had made it her life's work to descend into those shadows, bring names to the nameless, and never let silence become safety for the powerful again. And so she packed her notebook, her recorder, and a photo of Amira tucked inside the cover. She didn't need a script, just courage and memory, because the call that broke her wasn't just a cry for help, it was a summons, and Jasmine was still answering.